My grandfather was fighting for his life in the ICU, but my parents weren't watching him. They were glued to their phones in the corner. I thought they were grieving until I saw the screen flash. Transfer confirmed. $250,000 gone in a second. I froze. But nature didn't. The front door of my grandfather's house blew open, crashing against the wall as if the wind itself was forcing our family's darkest secret into the light. My name is Charlie Mendoza, and I was driving through a storm that felt personal. The weathermen called it an atmospheric river, a relentless hose of water blasting the Pacific Northwest. But as I hydroplaned my Subaru down the interstate toward Puget Sound Medical Center, it felt more like the sky was trying to wash us all away. I was 32 years old, yet the panic gripping my chest made me feel like a lost child. My phone sat in the cup holder, silent now after the terrifying call that had summoned me here. Rafael Mendoza, my grandfather, the man who had been my anchor when the rest of the world felt like drifting sand, was in the ICU when I finally burst through the automatic sliding doors of the hospital. Shaking the rain from my coat, the sterile silence of the lobby hit me harder than the wind outside. It was the smell that got to me first, that specific blend of floor wax, rubbing alcohol, and unspoken prayers. I navigated the labyrinth of hallways to the intensive care unit, my boots squeaking loudly on the linoleum, announcing my arrival to a world that did not care. Room 312 was dimly lit, the only illumination coming from the bank of monitors surrounding the bed. There he was, Rafael Mendoza. 78 years of old-school grit and gentle wisdom looked impossibly small beneath the white sheets. A ventilator tube snaked from his mouth, and the rhythmic beeping of the cardiac monitor was the only thing proving he was still with us. It sounded less like a heartbeat and more like a countdown. I expected to see my parents, Victor and Elena, sitting by his side. I expected tears. I expected Victor to be holding his father's hand, or Elena to be pacing with worry. Instead, I found them in the far corner of the room, as far away from the bed as they could get without leaving the room entirely. They were not looking at my grandfather. They were huddled together, their faces illuminated by the harsh, blue-white glow of their smartphone screens. I walked past them without a word, dropping my bag on a chair and moving straight to the bedside. I took my grandfather's hand. It felt cool and papery, lacking the strong, warm grip that had swung me onto his shoulders when I was 5. "I'm here, Papa," I whispered, squeezing his fingers. "Charlie is here." Behind me, I heard a sharp hiss of breath. It was my mother, Elena. I turned slightly. She wasn't looking at me. She was glaring at her phone screen, her thumb tapping furiously. "The connection is terrible in here," she muttered. Not to me, but to my father. "Just keep trying," Victor whispered back, his voice tight with a tension that didn't sound like grief. "We need the code before the session times out." I frowned, turning back to my grandfather. Maybe they were updating relatives. Maybe they were dealing with insurance. People grieved in weird ways. I told myself. I tried to focus on the rise and fall of Papa's chest. A doctor entered the room a moment later, looking exhausted. He introduced himself as Dr. Evans. He checked the monitors and then looked at us with that practiced, sympathetic expression medical professionals wear like a uniform. "The next 24 to 48 hours are critical, Doctor," Evans said, his voice soft but commanding. "The stroke was severe. We have induced a coma to let the brain swelling subside, but at his age, and with the severity of the hemorrhage, we are in uncharted territory." My stomach dropped. I looked at Papa, willing him to open his eyes, to crack one of his jokes about how he was too stubborn to die. "Is he in pain?" I asked, my voice cracking. "No," the doctor assured me. "He is heavily sedated. He likely can't hear us, but we encourage family to talk to him. Sometimes. It helps." "Doctor," my father's voice cut in. It was too loud, too sharp for the hushed room. Victor stepped out of the shadows. "If he does wake up within this 48-hour window, what will his mental state be?" "Doctor," Evans blinked, surprised by the pivot. "It is hard to say. Confusion is common, memory loss, aphasia. But would he be lucid? Victor pressed, his eyes narrowing. Would he be legally competent? You know, to make decisions, to sign documents. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. I stared at my father. His father was fighting for his life, and Victor was asking about his ability to sign paperwork. That is highly unlikely, Mr. Mendoza, the doctor said, his tone cooling. Our priority right now is survival, not administration. Victor nodded, looking disappointed rather than relieved that his father might survive. He stepped back to the corner and immediately began typing on his phone again. The doctor left, and a nurse came in to check the IV lines. She was a kind-faced woman who moved with gentle efficiency. As she adjusted the blanket around Papa's shoulder, she leaned in close to me. "You're the granddaughter, right?" she asked quietly. "Charlie?" "Yes," I said. She glanced over her shoulder at my parents, who were now arguing and hushed. Aggressive whispers near the coat rack. The nurse lowered her voice even further. "I just thought you should know," she murmured. "Your parents have been asking the nursing station about his personal effects every 10 minutes since they got here. They were very insistent on getting his wallet and his cell phone. We told them security locked everything in the safe, but they kept pushing." A cold prickle of unease danced down my spine. I looked at the nurse, then at my parents. "Thank you," I said, my voice barely audible. The nurse nodded and slipped out. I stood there, watching them. Elena was now rummaging through the plastic bag of patient belongings that had been left on the counter. His clothes, his shoes. She was shaking out his trousers, patting the pockets. "Mom," I said, "what are you doing?" Elena jumped, dropping the trousers. She shoved something into her pocket, her phone, I assumed, and smoothed her hair. Her face composed itself into a mask of tragic suffering so quickly it was almost impressive. "Just looking for his rosary, Charlie," she said, her voice trembling with fake emotion. I wanted to put it in his hand. I knew for a fact my grandfather didn't carry a rosary. He was a man of faith, but he kept his rosary on his nightstand at home, not in his pocket. "It's not there, Mom," I said flatly. She stepped away from the bag, her eyes darting to Victor. "Right. Well, we are going to the cafeteria to get coffee. Do you want anything?" "No," I said. "We might be a while," Victor added, not making eye contact. "Need to make some calls. Let people know." They walked out without touching Papa. They walked out without touching me. As the door slid shut behind them, the silence returned, heavy and suffocating, but it wasn't peaceful anymore. I sat down in the vinyl recliner next to the bed and pulled my legs up. Wrapping my arms around my knees, I watched the numbers on the monitor fluctuate. Heart rate, 82. Oxygen saturation, 99%. I looked at the bag of clothes my mother had been searching. I looked at the corner where they had been whispering about codes and transfers. I thought about the nurse's warning. Something was wrong. Not just medical wrong, something human was wrong. I reached out and took my grandfather's hand again. The storm outside was battering the window, demanding to be let in. "I am not going anywhere. Papa," I promised him in the dark. "I am staying right here." I settled in for the long haul. I thought I was sitting vigil for a dying man, keeping him company as he stood at death's door. I didn't realize then that I wasn't just a granddaughter keeping watch. I was a guard dog, and I wasn't protecting him from the Reaper. I was protecting him from the people who were supposed to love him the most. A robbery was in progress, and the thieves had the same last name as me. To understand why I sat in that plastic chair like a guard dog, you have to understand who Rafael Mendoza was to me, and who my parents were to him. To Victor and Elena, my grandfather was a bank vault with a heartbeat. To me, he was the only reason I survived my childhood with my soul intact. Growing up, my house was a cold place masked by expensive beige carpet and forced smiles. My parents looked at me and saw an investment that needed to yield a return. They wanted a doctor, a lawyer, or at least someone who married one. When I told them at 18 that I wanted to pursue community organization and nonprofit work, my mother looked at me as if I had announced I planned to live under a bridge. It was Papa who stepped in. He sat me down in his dusty study, smelling of old paper and cedar, and told me that a life lived for a paycheck is a slow death. He wrote the check for my tuition when my father refused. And he was the one who cheered the loudest when I landed my job as a project manager at Northline Community Initiatives. My work at Northline is specific. We build support systems for the elderly, helping them navigate a world that is increasingly hostile to anyone over 70. I spend my days dealing with housing insecurity, healthcare access, and, unfortunately, financial exploitation. I know the smell of a scam. I know the specific, desperate stink of a predator who smiles while they bleed a senior citizen dry. I just never thought I would smell it on my own parents. My father, Victor, had lived his entire life in a state of suspended resentment. He was the only son, but he lacked Papa's grit. Papa had built a small empire of real estate and investments from nothing, coming to this country with dirt under his fingernails and a fire in his belly. Victor had soft hands and a sense of entitlement that curdled into bitterness as he aged. He walked around with the heavy energy of a man who felt the world owed him a living simply because he existed. He would often complain that Papa treated him like an employee rather than an heir, never realizing that Papa simply refused to reward mediocrity. Then there was my mother, Elena. If Victor was the resentment, Elena was the facade. She was addicted to the appearance of wealth. We lived in a house we could barely afford, drove cars that were leased to the hilt, and threw dinner parties where the wine cost more than my weekly grocery budget. But behind the manicured lawn and the designer handbags, there was a quiet, terrifying avalanche of debt. I saw the late notices she tried to hide. I heard the hushed, angry phone calls with creditors that stopped abruptly when I walked into the room. They were drowning, and for years. They had managed to tread water by refinancing, borrowing, and robbing Peter to pay Paul. But 6 months ago, the dynamic shifted. The water must have finally reached their noses. Suddenly, Victor and Elena became the perfect children. For years, they had visited Papa maybe once a month, usually to ask for a loan. Now, they were there every weekend. They brought groceries. They offered to mow the lawn. They sat with him on the porch and listened to stories they had ignored for decades. My mother started talking about how overwhelmed Papa must be with his mail and offered to help him organize his bills. I was suspicious. But Papa was lonely. He was getting older, and despite his sharp mind, his body was slowing down. He wanted to believe his son was finally stepping up. He wanted to believe the family was healing. I bit my tongue because I saw how happy it made him to have a full Sunday dinner table. That was my mistake. 3 months ago, during a visit, I noticed the empty space on the mantel where his vintage mantel clock used to sit. It was a beautiful piece. French, from the 19th century. When I asked him about it, he frowned, looking confused. He told me he must have moved it to the attic and forgotten. A few weeks later, a small oil painting that had hung in the hallway since I was a child vanished. Again, Papa laughed it off, blaming his memory. He said he was getting old and putting things in strange places, but I knew Rafael Mendoza. He did not lose things. He was a man who labeled his spice jars and kept his tax returns from 1982 filed in chronological order. He wasn't losing his mind. He was being gaslit. The climax of this performance happened just 1 week before the stroke. I had driven over to Papa's house to fix his Wi-Fi, and as I pulled into the driveway, I saw it, a brand new luxury SUV. Gleaming black, parked next to my parents' sedan. It still had the temporary dealer plates. My parents were in the living room, drinking Papa's good scotch. Victor was beaming, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. He told us that one of his long-shot investments had finally paid off huge. He talked about cryptocurrency and foreign markets, using buzzwords that sounded impressive but meant nothing. Elena was stroking the leather arm of the sofa, looking at me with a strange, frantic intensity. They claimed they had won. They claimed they were flush with cash, but I work with people in crisis for a living. I read body language. When a person wins the lottery, they look lighter. They look free. My parents didn't look like winners. They looked like people who had just barely escaped a burning building. Their eyes were wide and darting, their laughter too loud, their movements jerky and adrenaline-fueled. It wasn't the look of success. It was the look of relief so profound it bordered on hysteria. I looked at Papa then. He was sitting in his armchair, smiling at them, proud that his son had finally made something work. He didn't know that the investment they were celebrating was likely his own money, siphoned off in chunks small enough to go unnoticed until it was too late. Now, sitting in the ICU, listening to the hum of the machines keeping him alive, the pieces slammed together in my mind, the missing antiques, the sudden interest in his mail, the new car, and now, the desperate whispers about codes and transfers while he lay dying. They weren't grieving. They were finalizing the transaction. Papa wasn't a father to them anymore. He was a window of opportunity that was about to close, and I was the only thing standing between them and the complete erasure of his legacy. I looked at my hands, clenched in my lap. I had spent my life building a career on protecting vulnerable strangers. I would be damned if I let the people who raised me victimize the man who saved me. By the third day in the intensive care unit, time had lost its shape. The sun rose and set, but inside the windowless box of room 312, the only rhythm was the mechanical hiss of the ventilator and the rhythmic beep of the cardiac monitor. My parents and I had established a cold, silent truce. We took turns sitting in the uncomfortable chairs, rotating out for coffee or naps in the waiting room, speaking only when absolutely necessary. It was mid-afternoon when opportunity didn't just knock. It fell into my lap. Victor stood up, stretching his back with a groan that sounded more annoyed than pained. He told me he was going to the cafeteria to get a sandwich and asked if I wanted anything. I declined, keeping my eyes fixed on my grandfather's chest, watching it rise and fall. Victor grabbed his jacket, but in his fatigue, or perhaps his arrogance, he made a critical error. He left his iPad Pro sitting on the bedside table, right next to Papa's paralyzed hand. For 10 minutes, I ignored it. I sat there holding Papa's hand, telling him about the rain outside, trying to tether him to this world with my voice. But then, the tablet screen lit up. It wasn't a call. It was a notification banner, bright and impossible to miss in the dim room. Transfer confirmed. $250,000. The number didn't make sense. It was too large. It was the kind of number you see on a mortgage closing statement, not a push notification on a Tuesday afternoon. My heart hammered against my ribs. I looked at the door. The hallway was empty. Victor had said he was getting a sandwich, which meant I had at least 15 minutes. I wrestled with my conscience for exactly 3 seconds. I told myself that privacy is for people who aren't acting suspicious. Privacy is for people who don't ask if a dying man can sign legal documents. If this was Papa's money, and I was his power of attorney designate, even if not yet official, silence was complicity. I reached out and tapped the screen. I expected a passcode lock. I prayed for one, actually, because if it was locked, I could go back to being the ignorant, grieving granddaughter. But Victor had set the auto lock to 5 minutes, and the notification had woken the device up. The screen slid open, revealing not a game or a news site, but a banking dashboard. It was the online portal for the Rafael Mendoza Living Trust. I felt the blood drain from my face, leaving me lightheaded. I knew this account. This was the nest egg Papa had built over 50 years. It was supposed to be untouchable, reserved for his long-term care and, eventually, to be split fairly according to his wishes. I scrolled down, and the horror set in. It wasn't just the $250,000. That was just the latest blow. The transaction history was a massacre. Dated yesterday. Outgoing wire to Apex Consulting, LLC, $85,000. Dated yesterday. Outgoing wire to Sunrise Holdings, $90,000. Dated 2 days ago. Outgoing wire to VM. Personal, $45,000. They were smart. I'll give them that. They weren't moving it all at once in a way that would trigger an immediate federal freeze. They were structuring the withdrawals, breaking the massive sum into smaller, jagged chunks that might fly under the radar of an automated fraud detection algorithm for a day or two. They were bleeding him dry, sip by sip, then gulp by gulp. I did a rough calculation in my head, my finger hovering over the glass. 250 plus 85 plus 90, plus the smaller transfers of $9,000 intended to avoid reporting requirements. The total was staggering. It was nearly $990,000 in less than 72 hours, while Papa lay in a coma fighting a brain bleed. My parents had liquidated almost $1 million of his assets. They had stripped the trust to the bone. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the tablet on the floor. I needed to know where the money was going, but more importantly, I needed to know why now. I swiped up to switch apps, my thumb trembling. I found their email client and the messaging app open in the background. I shouldn't have looked. Seeing the theft was one thing. Seeing the malice behind it was another. There was a thread between Victor and Elena time-stamped from just 20 minutes ago, while they were sitting 10 feet away from me. Victor. The last batch is pending. The bank manager is asking for voice authorization for anything over $300,000. I had to split it again. Elena. Do it fast. Marisol's flight lands tomorrow morning. If she gets here before the liquidity is moved, she will freeze everything. She knows the account numbers. Victor. I am trying. The network in this hospital is garbage. And then, the message that made me physically nauseous. It was from Victor. Sent late last night. Victor. We need to clear the main savings by Friday. If he wakes up, we are finished. He will check the balance the moment he is lucid. I stared at those words. If he wakes up, they weren't praying for his recovery. They were betting against it. They were racing against his survival. My grandfather wasn't a patient to them. He was a ticking time bomb, and they were trying to loot the vault before he exploded. I heard the squeak of rubber shoes in the hallway. Panic surged through me. I couldn't just memorize this. I needed proof. Hard, undeniable proof that couldn't be explained away as a glitch or a misunderstanding. I pulled my own phone from my pocket. I didn't trust the cloud, and I didn't trust sending anything to my regular email where my parents might guess the password. I opened my secure work email app. I held my phone over the tablet, snapping photos. Click. The transaction history showing the $990,000 draining away. Click. The recipient accounts with names that sounded like fake shell companies. Click. The text messages about Aunt Marisol. Click. The admission that they were finished if Papa woke up. The footsteps outside stopped. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. False alarm. Just a nurse checking the vitals in the next room. I quickly selected the photos and attached them to a new email. I typed the subject line, Evidence, RM Trust Theft. I sent it to my work address and BCC'd a private, encrypted Proton Mail account I used for sensitive client whistleblowing. Sent. I watched the progress bar complete. Then I closed the apps on Victor's tablet. I swiped it back to the home screen. I placed it exactly where it had been, angled slightly toward the bed, the cover folded just so. I sat back in the chair and picked up my book, a novel I hadn't read a single page of in 3 days. I forced my breathing to slow down. In, 2, 3, 4, out, 2, 3, 4. When Victor walked back in 2 minutes later, smelling of stale coffee and ham, I didn't look up immediately. I waited a beat, then turned a page. Did you get your sandwich? I asked. My voice sounded thin, but steady. Yeah, Victor said, wiping crumbs from his mouth. He walked over to the nightstand and picked up the iPad. He tapped the screen, checked something, presumably to see if the $250,000 had cleared, and then let out a small, satisfied sigh. Any change with Papa? No, I lied. Nothing. But everything had changed. 10 minutes ago, I was a worried daughter dealing with messy family dynamics. Now, I was a witness to a grand larceny. I looked at my father, really looked at him. I saw the slight tremor in his hands, not from grief, but from the adrenaline of the heist. This wasn't a crime of passion. It wasn't a desperate mistake made in a moment of panic. This was a rehearsal. They had the accounts ready. They knew Marisol's flight schedule. They knew the bank's transfer limits. They had been planning this for months, waiting for the moment Papa was incapacitated. I gripped the spine of my book until my knuckles turned white. They thought they had gotten away with it. They thought the money was gone and the secret was safe. But they didn't know that the real transfer that had happened in this room wasn't the $990,000. It was the transfer of my loyalty. I wasn't their daughter anymore. I was the opposition. And unlike them, I had the receipts. The hallway outside the ICU was a different world. Cold, sterile, and echoing with the distant sounds of hospital machinery. I paced the length of the corridor, clutching my phone like a lifeline. The storm outside was wreaking havoc on the cell towers. I tried to call my Aunt Marisol, Papa's younger sister, who lived in Florida. She was the only other person in this family with a spine, and right now, I needed backup. The call connected for a split second, just long enough for me to hear a wash of static and her frantic voice shouting my name. "Charlie? Is he gone?" "No," I shouted back, pressing the phone against my ear. "He is still with us. But Marisol, listen to me. Victor and Elena are—" The line crackled violently and went dead. I cursed under my breath and tried again. Call failed. The atmospheric river wasn't just drowning the city. It was cutting off my communications. I couldn't risk a long explanation via text that might not go through, or worse, that my parents might somehow see if they had access to family cloud accounts I didn't know about. I kept it terrifyingly simple. I typed, "Major issue. Money being drained. Get here now." I watched the blue progress bar inch across the top of the screen. It hung at 90% for an agonizing 10 seconds before finally delivered. Okay, step 1 complete. The cavalry was alerted, even if she was 3,000 miles away. Now for step 2. I needed professional advice, and I needed it off the record. I scrolled through my contacts until I found Tessa Grant. Tessa was an old college friend who had climbed the ladder to become a senior compliance officer at a major regional bank. We hadn't spoken in 6 months, but she was the only person who could tell me if I was crazy or if I was witnessing a crime in real time. She picked up on the second ring. "Charlie, everything okay? I saw on Facebook about your grandfather." "It is bad, Tessa," I said, keeping my voice low and turning my back to the security cameras. "But I need to ask you something hypothetical, and I need you to answer me as a friend, not a bank officer." There was a pause. "Okay, I am listening. If a family member with power of attorney, or maybe just access, started moving large sums of money out of a trust while the grantor was in a coma, what happens? I am talking about nearly $1 million in 3 days, structured transfers, under the reporting limits." The silence on the other end was heavy. When Tessa spoke, her voice had lost all its warmth. It was sharp, professional, and deadly serious. "Hypothetically," she said, stressing the word, "that is textbook elder financial exploitation. If the transfers are structured to avoid the $10,000 reporting threshold, that is a federal crime called smurfing. It triggers immediate red flags if the algorithm catches it." "And if the algorithm hasn't caught it yet?" I asked. "Then you need to trigger it manually," Tessa said. "Most banks have a specific fraud unit for vulnerable adults. You can't stop the transfers yourself if you are not on the account, but you can file a report. You need dates, amounts, and account numbers. But Charlie," she hesitated, "once you pull that trigger, the bank freezes everything. The investigation is mandatory. Police get involved. Adult Protective Services gets involved. You can't unring that bell." "I know," I said, staring at the rain lashing against the window at the end of the hall. "How do I preserve the evidence before they wipe it?" "Screenshots are good," she said, "but the bank's internal logs are better. They can't delete those. What they can do is hide the destination. If they are moving cash to shell accounts or crypto, recovery becomes a nightmare. If you think they are doing this, they are probably trying to physically secure any hard documentation right now. Checkbooks, ledgers, Deeds, if they get those, they can construct a narrative that the transfers were authorized before the medical event. Hard documentation, I repeated. Got it. Be careful, Tessa warned. People do crazy things when 7 figures are on the line. Call me if you need the direct line to the fraud department. I hung up, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Hard documentation. That was the key. Victor and Elena were digital tourists. They were clumsy with the tech, but they knew paper. They knew that if they could find signed blank checks or a power of attorney document that predated the stroke, they could backdate everything and claim Papa told them to do it. I took a deep breath, smoothed my hair, and walked back into room 312. The performance of a lifetime was about to begin. Victor and Elena were exactly where I left them, huddled in the corner. They jumped slightly when I entered. Is everything all right? Elena asked, her eyes darting to my phone. Just work, I sighed, letting my shoulders slump. I rubbed my temples, feigning exhaustion. My boss is being a nightmare about the project deadlines. I told him I am at the hospital, but you know how it is. I walked over to the bed and adjusted Papa's blanket, making sure to keep my back to them so they couldn't see the calculation in my eyes. Then I turned around and gave them a weak, defeated smile. Look, I said, looking from Victor to Elena. I am overwhelmed. I can't think about the insurance or the billing or any of the administrative stuff right now. I just want to focus on Papa. Can I trust you guys to handle the financial side of things, dealing with the hospital and the insurance? The relief that washed over their faces was instantaneous and grotesque. Victor actually straightened up, puffing out his chest. Of course, Charlie, he said, his voice dropping into a soothing, paternal register that made my skin crawl. You shouldn't have to worry about money. Your mother and I have it under control. We will handle all the paperwork. Thanks, I said. I really appreciate it. I'm just going to sit here with him for a while. Take your time, Elena said. We actually need to step out for a bit, to get some fresh air, maybe go back to the hotel and shower. Go ahead, I said. I will be here. They left 5 minutes later. I waited 10 minutes, then walked to the nurse's station. I asked the nurse on duty, a different one this time, if my parents had left the floor. She confirmed they had taken the elevator down to the parking garage. I didn't relax. Instead, I began to track them, not with a GPS, but with logic. Over the next 4 hours, they were ghosts. They didn't come back to the hotel to shower. I called the front desk of the nearby Marriott, where we were all staying, and asked to be connected to their room. No answer. They returned to the ICU at 6 p.m, looking disheveled and wet. They didn't ask about Papa's vitals. They didn't ask if he had moved. They walked in, looked at the monitors to ensure he was still comatose, and then retreated to their corner. I pretended to be asleep in the chair, my head resting on the mattress near Papa's hand. I regulated my breathing, keeping it slow and heavy. He is out cold, Victor whispered. Did you get the safe code? Elena hissed back. No, I told you. I tried the birthday and the anniversary. Nothing worked. We need the physical key or the master override. It has to be in the house, Elena said. It has to be. He never threw anything away. I am telling you. We looked in the study, Victor argued. It wasn't in the desk. We didn't look in the wall safe behind the painting, Elena pressed. And we didn't check the basement file cabinet. If the deed is there, we can transfer the property before the freeze hits. My eyes snapped open beneath my closed lids. The property. They weren't just after the cash. They were going for the house, the land, everything. We can't do it now, Victor said. Charlie is here. She is asleep, Elena dismissed. And even if she wakes up, she is clueless. Did you hear her earlier? She begged us to handle the finances. She doesn't want to know. Fine, Victor said. We wait until the shift change. We tell her we are taking the night shift. Then we send her back to the hotel. Once she is gone, I will go to the house. You stay here and stall if she comes back. No, Elena said. I am not staying here alone. We go together. It will take half an hour to toss the office properly. We can be back before she even wakes up in the morning." "Okay," Victor agreed. "Tonight, we have to go to the house tonight. There is something I need to get before Marisol lands." I lay there, my heart hammering against the mattress, listening to them plot the final looting of my grandfather's life. They were going to the house tonight. They were going to tear it apart looking for the deed and the keys to the physical assets. If they found the original will, the one I knew Papa kept in the house, they would destroy it. If they found the updated power of attorney naming me, they would burn it. I couldn't let them get there first. I waited until they settled into a rhythm of scrolling on their phones. Then, I sat up, rubbing my eyes and yawning loudly. "What time is it?" I mumbled. "Almost 7, Victor said, putting on a sympathetic face. "You have been asleep for a while." "I feel terrible," I said, standing up and stretching. "My head is pounding. I think I need to go get some real coffee. Maybe drive around for 20 minutes to clear my head. The air in here is stifling." "That is a good idea," Elena said quickly. "Take your time. Drive safe in the rain." "I will," I said. I leaned down and kissed Papa's forehead. "I will be right back. Papa." I grabbed my purse and walked out. I didn't run until I hit the stairwell. Then, I took the stairs 2 at a time, flying down 4 flights to the parking garage. My car was parked in the shadows. I unlocked it and threw myself into the driver's seat. My hands were shaking as I jammed the key into the ignition. I didn't need to break in. Papa had given me a key to his house 5 years ago, after I helped him install his new security system. For emergencies, he had said, in case I fall and can't get up. Well, he had fallen, and the wolves were at the door. I backed out of the spot and gunned the engine. The drive to Papa's house was typically 40 minutes. In this storm, it would be an hour. Victor and Elena were still in the room, probably waiting for me to leave the hospital grounds before they made their move. I had a head start, but not a big one. If I didn't find those documents before they did, the $990,000 they had already stolen would just be the appetizer. They would take the house, the land, and the legacy. I merged onto the highway, the rain blinding, the wipers fighting a losing battle against the deluge. I wasn't Charlie the granddaughter anymore. I was Charlie the project manager, and I was on a deadline that couldn't be missed. The trap was set, but I had to be the bait, the switch, and the executioner all at once, and I had to do it in a house that was dark, empty, and full of secrets. The drive to my grandfather's house was a battle against the elements. The coastal highway was a ribbon of slick asphalt, winding through a darkness so absolute it felt physical. The atmospheric river had turned the world into a blur of gray and black. The rain hammering against my windshield with the force of gravel. By the time I turned onto the gravel driveway, leading to the bluff where Papa's house stood, my knuckles were white on the steering wheel. The house usually looked like a sanctuary, a warm beacon of cedar and glass overlooking the Pacific. Tonight, it looked like a shipwreck. The power was out in the neighborhood, leaving the structure silhouetted against the stormy sky, jagged and imposing. I killed the headlights before I reached the top of the driveway. Rolling the last 50 yards in darkness, I didn't want to announce my arrival. I parked my car behind the detached garage, hidden from the main road, and grabbed the heavy flashlight I kept in my glove compartment. I approached the front door, the wind whipping my hair across my face. Stinging my cheeks, I raised the flashlight, and the beam cut through the rain to reveal the first sign that my parents had been busy. The brass lock plate was scratched and gouged. There were deep tool marks around the deadbolt. The wood splintered and raw. It looked like a violent break-in. The work of a desperate junkie looking for a quick score, but I knew better. Victor and Elena had a set of keys. Papa had given them a spare set 2 Christmases ago. They hadn't forced the door because they had to. They had forced it to create a narrative. They were staging a burglary to explain away whatever they were about to steal. I pushed the door. It swung open with a groan that was lost in the roar of the wind. I stepped inside, shaking the water from my coat. The silence of the house was heavier than the storm outside. But it wasn't the smell of old wood and sea salt that hit me. It was the sharp, chemical tang of bleach and lemon-scented industrial cleaner. They had been cleaning. Why would you clean a house you were robbing? Unless you were scrubbing away fingerprints, DNA, or the evidence of your own presence. I swept the flashlight beam across the living room. It was a scene of calculated chaos. Drawers from the sideboard were pulled out and dumped on the floor. Books were swept off shelves. It looked dramatic, but upon closer inspection, it was too theatrical. The TV was still there. The stereo system was untouched. A real thief takes the electronics. My parents were looking for paper. I moved down the hallway toward Papa's study, the heart of the house. The door was ajar. I pushed it open and stifled a gasp. The room had been tossed. The filing cabinets were open, folders spilling their guts onto the Persian rug. Bank statements, medical records, and tax returns from the 90s were scattered like confetti. I shone the light on the wall behind the desk. The large oil painting of the coastline, which usually hid the wall safe, was on the floor. The frame cracked. The safe door stood wide open, empty. My heart sank. The deed to the house, his passport, the vintage watches he collected, all gone. I walked over to the desk. The computer monitor was dark, but when I touched the tower on the floor, the casing was still warm. Someone had been here recently, probably right before they came to the hospital to relieve me. They had been downloading files or wiping drives. But they didn't know everything. Papa was a man of secrets, but he had shared one with me when I was 10. He showed me the desk. It was a massive, hand-carved oak piece from the 1920s. He had shown me that if you pulled the center drawer out exactly 3 inches and pressed a hidden catch on the underside, a false bottom in the right-hand pedestal would click open. For the things that matter. Charlie. He had told me. Not the money, the truth. I prayed the mechanism still worked. I prayed my parents' greed had made them sloppy and impatient. I pulled the center drawer. 1 inch, 2 inches, 3. I held my breath and ran my fingers along the rough wood underneath until I felt the small, cold metal nub. I pressed it. Click. A panel on the side of the desk popped open, revealing a narrow, velvet-lined cavity. My parents hadn't found it. Inside lay a single, thick manila envelope labeled in Papa's distinctive, shaky handwriting. Essential documents. I pulled it out, my hands trembling. I opened the clasp and slid the contents onto the desk surface, shining my flashlight directly on the pages. The first document was a last will and testament, dated and notarized only 4 months ago. I scanned the legalese, my eyes widening. It revoked all previous wills. It established a trust for the majority of the estate. And then I saw it. The executor was not Victor Mendoza. It was Charlotte Mendoza. Me. The distribution clause was even more damning. It explicitly stated that Victor and Elena were to receive a monthly stipend, an allowance, managed by the executor. Subject to drug testing and financial audits, they were getting an allowance, like children. Because Papa knew, he knew about the gambling, the debts, the recklessness. He had protected his legacy from them. But the second document was the smoking gun. It was a durable power of attorney for finances. Victor had been waving a power of attorney document around at the hospital, bullying the nurses. I realize now that document must have been an old one, or a forgery, because the paper in my hand, signed in blue ink with a raised notary seal, appointed me, Charlie Mendoza, as his sole agent, and there was a handwritten note in the margin, initialed by Papa. Victor and Elena have been removed due to concerns regarding undue influence and financial irregularity. He knew. He had known for months. This was why they were frantic. This was why they were draining the accounts in structured amounts of $9,000. They knew this document existed, or they suspected it did. They weren't just stealing money. They were racing to erase the legal reality that stripped them of everything. If they found this, they would burn it. Without this paper, they reverted to being the next of kin. With this paper, they were just thieves. I pulled out my phone. I didn't just take photos. I used a scanning app to create high-resolution PDFs of every single page. I uploaded them immediately to the secure cloud storage I shared with my firm's legal team. Then I took photos of the physical location, the hidden compartment, and the date on the notary stamp. I was just sliding the documents back into the envelope, preparing to hide them in my jacket, when the room suddenly flooded with light. It wasn't the power coming back on. Twin beams of high-intensity LED headlights swept across the window, cutting through the rain and illuminating the study walls in a stark, moving brightness. A car had just pulled into the driveway. I froze. The engine cut off. I heard the heavy thud of car doors slamming shut. Then, voices. Angry, loud voices, carrying over the wind. "I am telling you." I felt a draft. Victor's voice drifted from the front porch. "It is the wind." "You idiot," Elena snapped. "Just get the door open. We need to find that file before the storm gets worse." My stomach turned to ice. They weren't supposed to be here yet. They must have left the hospital 10 minutes after I did. Driving like maniacs to beat me to the punch, I was trapped. My car was hidden behind the garage, but I was inside the house. The only way out was the back sliding door leading to the deck, which dropped off toward the beach. I shoved the envelope into the waistband of my jeans. Under my sweater, I gripped the flashlight like a weapon. They weren't just looting the accounts anymore. They were here to sanitize the crime scene. They were here to find the very piece of paper pressing against my spine. If they found me here, with the proof of their disinheritance in my hand, the dynamic wouldn't just be awkward, it would be dangerous. I clicked off my flashlight, plunging the room back into darkness. The front door handle rattled. Then, the heavy footsteps of my parents echoed on the hardwood floor of the entryway. "Flashlights on," Victor commanded. "Start in the bedroom. Tear the mattress apart if you have to." "I'm going to the study," Elena said. "I want to check that desk again." I pressed my back against the wall. Shielded by the heavy velvet curtains of the patio door, I held my breath, listening to the click-clack of my mother's heels coming down the hallway. Getting closer and closer. They were looking for a license to steal, and I was holding the revocation. The house was silent, but the war had officially begun. I slipped out through the sliding glass door onto the deck, the sound of the wind masking the slide of the track. The storm was a chaotic wall of noise that swallowed my footsteps as I sprinted through the rain back to my car behind the garage. My heart was hammering against my ribs, not just from the near miss in the study, but from the adrenaline of holding the physical evidence that would end my parents' charade. I locked the car doors and slumped low in the seat, the windows instantly fogging up from my heavy breathing. My phone buzzed in my lap. It was Aunt Marisol again. The signal was weak, fluctuating between 1 bar and none, but the call connected. "Charlie," she shouted over the static. I got through to the fraud department. They froze the last transfer. They stopped about $150,000 from leaving the trust. That leaves over $800,000 gone. "Marisol," I said, wiping water from my face. "Where did it go? Did they track the destination?" "That is the thing," Marisol said, her voice dropping lower. "I spoke to a friend in the district attorney's office. I had to call in a favor. Charlie, this is not just about greed. Victor is in trouble, real trouble." I stared at the rain lashing the windshield. "What kind of trouble?" "He is being investigated by the SEC, Marisol said. "Apparently, that investment firm he was bragging about? It was a Ponzi scheme, but it gets worse. Victor wasn't just an investor. He was recruiting people. He brought in friends, neighbors. When the bottom fell out 2 weeks ago, he was left holding the bag for nearly $500,000 in restitution. If he doesn't pay it back immediately, he is looking at federal prison time for fraud and conspiracy." The pieces of the puzzle clicked together with a sickening sound. The desperation, the sweat on Victor's forehead, the frantic need for liquidity. He wasn't stealing to buy a yacht. He was stealing to buy his freedom. "And Elena?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "Credit card debt," Marisol sighed. "She has been financing that lifestyle on high-interest plastic for a decade. She is leveraged up to her eyeballs. If Victor goes down, she loses the house, the cars, the status, everything." I hung up the phone and looked down at the screenshots I had taken earlier on the iPad. I zoomed in on the transaction history. I had been so focused on the total amount that I hadn't scrutinized the recipients closely enough. There were the usual shell companies, but one transfer stood out. It was a wire for exactly $200,000 sent to something called the Clementine Heritage Foundation. It sounded noble. It sounded like a charity. But I work in the nonprofit sector. I know how to vet a 501c3. I opened my browser and ran a search on the foundation's tax ID number, which was listed in the transfer details. No results found in the IRS database. I switched to the state business registry. There it was. The Clementine Heritage Foundation wasn't a charity. It was a limited liability company registered just 3 months ago, and the registered agent wasn't a stranger. The name on the filing was Julian Castillo. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp clothes clinging to my skin. Julian. Cousin Julian. He wasn't really a cousin, just a distant relative on my grandmother's side who showed up at weddings and funerals in Italian suits, flashing a gold watch and talking about venture capital. I remembered the last family barbecue. Julian had been cornering Victor by the grill, speaking in low, intense tones. I had thought they were discussing football. Now I realized Julian wasn't just a relative. He was the shark in the water. I tapped on the Officers tab of the LLC. Julian was the sole proprietor. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Julian must have been the one running the investment scheme, or at least he was the one holding the leverage over Victor. This wasn't just a bailout. This was blackmail. Julian was squeezing my parents, forcing them to liquidate their own father's estate to cover the tracks of a crime they had all participated in. The $200,000 to the foundation wasn't a donation. It was hush money. My parents were trapped. If they didn't pay Julian, he would expose Victor to the SEC and likely ruin them socially and legally. If they did pay him, they had to rob a dying man to do it. For a brief, fleeting second, I felt a pang of pity. They were terrified. They were cornered animals gnawing off their own legs to escape a trap. But then I looked at the dark house where they were currently tearing apart my grandfather's study. I thought about Papa lying in that hospital bed, his brain bleeding, while his son and daughter-in-law calculated his net worth down to the penny. "No," I whispered to the empty car. "Being cornered does not give you the right to rob a coma patient." They had a choice. They could have come to Papa when he was awake. They could have confessed. They could have faced the consequences of their own greed. Instead, they chose to victimize the one person who had never done anything but support them. They chose to make me an accomplice. I wasn't going to let them win. I wasn't going to let Julian win. I opened my secure email app again. I composed a new message. The recipient was Nolan Pierce, Papa's longtime attorney. He was a shark of a different kind, the kind that swam in legal waters and ate fraudsters for breakfast. Subject: urgent. Unauthorized liquidation of Rafael Mendoza estate. I attached everything: the photos of the bank transfers, the screenshots of the text messages, the PDF of the Clementine Heritage Foundation business registration linking it to Julian, and finally, the scans of the valid power of attorney and will I had just retrieved from the secret compartment. I typed a brief message. Nolan, my parents are currently inside the house attempting to locate and destroy the original estate documents. They have already transferred nearly $1 million. A significant portion has gone to a shell company owned by Julian Castillo. This is not just theft. It is blackmail and elder abuse. I have the original power of attorney securing my authority. Please execute the emergency freeze immediately and notify the authorities. I hit send. The little paper airplane icon swooshed away, carrying with it the destruction of my family as I knew it. I watched the house. The flashlight beams were still moving inside, frantic and jerky. They hadn't found what they were looking for because it was currently tucked inside my jacket. They were getting desperate. I knew they wouldn't leave empty-handed. They would come back. They would keep tearing that house apart until they found the paper that legitimized their theft. But they were too late. The digital paper trail was already on its way to the one man who could turn their investment strategy into a prison sentence. I started the car engine, not to leave, but to warm up the heater. I wasn't going anywhere. I was going to sit right here in the dark and wait. I watched the front door, knowing that when they walked out, they wouldn't just be my parents anymore. They would be defendants. The wind howled around the car, shaking the frame, but inside, I was perfectly still. The trap was sprung. Now, I just had to wait for the catch. I watched from the driveway as the flashlight beams danced frantically inside the living room windows. Sitting in the safety of my locked car, I realized that waiting for them to come out wasn't enough. Inside that house, my grandfather's sanctuary was being violated. They were tearing apart cushions, likely searching for the backup keys to the wall safe or the physical deed to the property. If they didn't find the papers I had tucked inside my jacket, they would destroy the house looking for them. I killed the engine. I wasn't going to wait for the police. I needed to look them in the eye. I slipped back through the rain, rounding the house to the back deck. The sliding door was still unlatched from my exit. I slid it open just enough to squeeze through, the roar of the ocean masking the sound of the rollers. I stepped into the shadows of the dining room, shaking and cold, but my mind was diamond hard. Victor and Elena were in the living room. They moved with the entitlement of ownership, their flashlights cutting through the gloom like lightsabers. "Check the bookshelf," Victor commanded, his voice echoing off the hardwood. He used to keep a hollowed-out dictionary in there. The master code might be in it. "I am checking," Elena snapped, sweeping a row of novels onto the floor with a crash. "Stop hovering. Did you check the grandfather clock?" "It is locked," Victor muttered. "I need a screwdriver, or a crowbar. We don't have time for tools. Victor, just break the glass." "You break the glass," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but in the tense silence of the house, it sounded like a gunshot. Both beams of light swung violently toward me. I stood in the archway between the dining and living rooms, my hands deep in my pockets, gripping the envelope against my ribs. I didn't blink. "Charlie?" Elena's voice cracked. She lowered her flashlight, squinting. "What are you doing here? We thought you were at the hotel." "I know," I said, stepping fully into the light. "You thought I was asleep. You thought Papa was helpless. And you thought you could drain $990,000 from the trust without anyone noticing." The silence that followed was absolute. Victor froze, his hand still reaching for a porcelain vase on the mantel. His face, illuminated by the peripheral glow of Elena's light, went the color of ash. "I don't know what you are talking about," Victor stammered, his eyes darting to the front door. "We are here to secure the property, the storm." "Stop," I cut him off. "I saw the transfers. Dad, I saw the structuring. 85,000, 90,000. I saw the messages about Marisol, and I know about the $200,000 you sent to the Clementine Heritage Foundation." Elena let out a sharp, wounded noise, like a kicked dog. She took a step toward me, her face shifting from shock to a terrifying, desperate maternal mask. "Charlie, listen to me," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "You don't understand. It is complicated. We borrowed it. We just borrowed it. It is an investment strategy to protect the assets from taxes." "It is a Ponzi scheme restitution payment," I said. "And blackmail money for Julian." Victor dropped the vase. It shattered on the hearth, the sound sharp and final. He abandoned the pretense of the search. He marched toward me, his face twisting into something ugly, fear masquerading as authority. "You have no idea what you are messing with," he hissed. "This isn't a game. Charlotte, if that money doesn't clear by tomorrow, we lose everything. This house, your car, our reputation. Do you want to see your parents in handcuffs? Is that what you want?" "I want you to stop stealing from your dying father," I said, holding my ground. "We are saving this family," Elena screamed, abandoning the whisper. "We did everything for you. The private schools, the lessons. Who paid for that? We have debts, Charlie, unimaginable debts. If we go down, the shame will destroy you too. You work in nonprofit. Who will hire the daughter of convicted felons?" "That is a good question," I said. "I guess we will find out." "Give me your phone," Victor demanded, advancing on me. And give me whatever papers you took from the desk. I know you found the compartment. I saw the drawer was open. I wouldn't come closer, I warned. Give it to me. Victor lunged, but Elena grabbed his arm, pulling him back. She wasn't protecting me. She was calculating. Charlie? Sweetie, she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Think about this. He is in a coma. He might never wake up. Why let the money sit there? We can split it. We can set you up. You can quit that depressing job. We can be a family again. I looked at them. The greed, the fear, the utter lack of remorse. They weren't sorry they did it. They were sorry they got caught. It is too late for deals, I said, pulling my phone out just enough to show the screen. I already sent everything to Nolan Pierce, the screenshots, the bank logs, the Julian connection, and the new power of attorney naming me as the sole agent. Victor looked like he had been punched in the gut. Did you send it to the lawyer? It is in his inbox, I said. And the fraud department at the bank has already frozen the remaining funds. So the only question left is simple. Do you want to walk out of here and try to mitigate the damage with a plea deal? Or do you want to keep threatening me and ensure you go to prison for the maximum term? Victor roared, a primal, frustrated sound, and turned back to the wall safe, clawing at the painting on the floor as if the solution was still hidden behind it. We can't leave, he shouted at Elena. We need the deed. If we have the deed, we can still leverage the equity. Elena turned to me, her eyes hard. She moved between me and the hallway, blocking the exit. You are not leaving this room. Charlotte, you are going to call the lawyer and tell him it was a mistake. You are going to fix this. Move, Mom, I said. No, she said, grabbing my wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong. You are an ungrateful, selfish little girl. We gave you life. And you are stealing his, I shouted back, yanking my arm away. The tension in the room snapped. Victor grabbed a heavy brass candlestick and turned toward me, his eyes wild. Elena lunged again, trying to pin me against the wall, and then the house exploded. It wasn't a bomb. It was the atmospheric river delivering its final verdict. A gust of wind, clocked later at 80 miles per hour, slammed into the front of the house, the heavy oak front door, which they had damaged with their pry bars and failed to secure properly. Didn't just open, it blew off its hinges. Crack boom, the sound was deafening, like a thunderclap inside the room. The door flew inward, smashing against the entryway wall with enough force to crack the plaster. Immediately, the house security alarm began to shriek, a piercing, rhythmic wail that assaulted the senses. The storm rushed in. Rain, horizontal and freezing, swept into the foyer like a tidal wave. Papers from the overturned drawers swirled into the air, dancing in the vortex of wind. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in a second. Victor dropped the candlestick, covering his ears. Elena screamed, stumbling back from the wind. I stood there, hair whipping across my face, watching the chaos. It felt biblical. It felt right. Through the gaping hole where the door used to be, 2 beams of light cut through the rain from the driveway. Not flashlights this time. Spotlights. A vehicle had pulled up behind Victor's car. It was the private security patrol for the neighborhood. Alerted by the silent alarm that had tripped when I first entered the back deck, or perhaps by the neighbors who heard the shouting, a figure in a yellow rain slicker stepped into the frame of the broken door, hand resting on a holster. "Private security!" A voice boomed over the wind and the siren. "Hands where I can see them. Police are en route." My parents froze. Victor looked at the guard, then at me, then at the scattered papers swirling around his feet. The private, toxic bubble of our family drama had just been popped. We weren't in the living room anymore. We were on a stage, and the audience had arrived. I looked at my mother, whose makeup was running down her face in the spray of the rain. She looked small. She looked common. "It is over," I mouthed, though she couldn't hear me over the alarm. The wind howled through the open door, cleansing the house of its stale air, its secrets, and its lies. The front door hadn't just blown open. The truth had just kicked it down. The storm had turned the living room into a wind tunnel. But the arrival of the private security officer, a burly man named Mike, whom I recognized from the neighborhood gate, sucked the oxygen right out of my parents' lungs. He didn't care about family dynamics. He saw a broken door, a shattered vase, and two people screaming at a woman who looked like she was holding on to her sanity by a thread. He unclipped his radio and called the local police, his voice flat and authoritative, cutting through Victor's stammering attempts to explain that this was just a domestic misunderstanding. When the sheriff's deputies arrived 10 minutes later, their blue and red lights strobing against the rain-slicked siding of the house, the dynamic shifted from a family argument to a crime scene investigation. They separated us immediately. Victor and Elena were ushered into the kitchen, while I was kept in the ruined entryway, shivering in my damp coat. I didn't waste time trying to win a sympathy contest. I knew that in situations like this, the person with the best paperwork wins. I pulled out my phone and opened the secure file I had sent to Nolan Pierce. "Officer," I said to the deputy taking my statement, a stern woman named Sergeant Davis, "this is not a domestic dispute. This is an active burglary and a case of elder financial exploitation. I am the legal power of attorney for the homeowner, Rafael Mendoza, who is currently in a coma at Puget Sound Medical Center." I showed her the digital scan of the document I had retrieved from the secret compartment. I showed her the date, the notary stamp, and the clause explicitly removing my parents. Then I showed her the photos of the door frame they had pried open. "They have keys," I said, my voice steady despite the cold. "But they staged a break-in to cover their tracks. They are looking for the physical copy of this document to destroy it." Sergeant Davis looked at the phone, then at the door, then at the kitchen where Victor was loudly proclaiming his rights. She didn't arrest them. Financial crimes are complex and rarely result in handcuffs on a rainy Tuesday night. But she did exactly what I needed. She wrote a report. She documented the damage, the unauthorized access, and my claim of financial theft. She created an official paper trail that Victor couldn't talk his way out of. While the police were questioning my parents, my phone vibrated. It was Nolan Pierce. "Charlie," his voice was gravelly, likely waking up from a deep sleep. But his mind was sharp. "I got your email. I have Tessa on the other line. We have triggered the emergency freeze protocols." "Did you catch it?" I asked, turning away from the deputies so my parents couldn't hear. "The $990,000? "We caught the tail end," Nolan said. "But Charlie, you need to understand the architecture of what they did. This wasn't a simple transfer. It is a spiderweb," Tessa's voice chimed in, sounding tinny over the conference line. "They didn't just send money to the Clementine Heritage Foundation. That was just the largest chunk. We are seeing wire transfers to 4 different crypto exchanges, 2 offshore holding companies in the Cayman Islands, and a payment processor that specializes in high-risk gambling debts. They split the $990,000 into over 30 separate transactions." "Smurfing," I said, the term tasting like ash in my mouth. "They were trying to keep it under the reporting radar." "Exactly," Tessa said. "But because they did it so fast, the bank's fraud I flagged the pattern as account takeover. We have locked the accounts. No money goes out, no money comes in. But the money that has already left Charlie, recovering that is going to be a civil war." I looked toward the kitchen. Victor was leaning over the island, gesturing wildly. Elena was sitting on a stool, her face buried in her hands. "They said they were protecting the assets," I told Nolan. "That is their story. They claim they moved the money to shield it." "That defense won't hold water," Nolan said. "Not with the timestamps. We have logs of them accessing the accounts from the hospital Wi-Fi at 3 in the morning. We have the text messages you screenshotted. And now, thanks to the police report you are filing, we have proof of illegal entry. I am filing for an emergency temporary restraining order against them regarding the estate assets first thing in the morning." The police finished their initial walkthrough and brought us all back into the living room. The wind was still blowing through the open door, but the emotional temperature was absolute zero. "Mr. And Mrs. Mendoza, Sergeant Davis said, addressing my parents. At this time, we are not making custodial arrests. However, based on the evidence provided by Ms. Mendoza and the condition of the property, we are filing a report for burglary and suspicion of financial abuse. You are ordered to leave the premises immediately. You are not to remove any items from this house, not a paperclip. Victor turned purple. This is my father's house. I have a right to be here. We were securing his valuables. The security logs show the alarm was disabled using an override code that was deleted 6 months ago, I said, cutting him off. And the camera in the hallway recorded you tossing the study. You weren't securing valuables. Dad, you were looking for the will. Victor opened his mouth to argue, but the look on Sergeant Davis's face stopped him. He grabbed his coat. Elena didn't move. She looked at me, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow. She walked over, ignoring the officer's hand raised to stop her, and grabbed my arm. "Charlie," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Please, you have to stop this. You don't know what you are doing. If the freezing order goes through, if Julian doesn't get the rest of the money by Friday." "Where is the money, Mom?" I asked, looking down at her. "The $990,000. Is it sitting in a secure account? Or is it already gone to pay off Dad's fraud and your credit cards?" She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She couldn't say it was safe because it wasn't. It was gone, vaporized into the ether of their bad decisions. "We can pay it back," she sobbed, clutching my sleeve. "We just need time, but you have to tell the lawyer to lift the freeze. If you don't, they will come for us. They will come for you, too." "Let go of me," I said softly. She released me, looking at me like I was a stranger. "You are destroying this family," she spat, the sorrow instantly hardening into hate. "I am saving what is left of it," I replied. Victor grabbed her arm and dragged her toward the door. As they stepped out into the rain, the headlights of their car illuminating the broken frame of the front door, my phone buzzed again. It was a text from Nolan. "Nolan, Charlie, call me. Now. I just pulled the court filings to prepare the restraining order. We have a problem." I dialed him back immediately, watching the taillights of my parents' car disappear down the driveway. "What is it?" I asked. "I found a petition filed 3 days ago," Nolan said, his voice grim. "Victor and Elena didn't just try to steal the money. They went on the offensive legally." I felt a cold pit open in my stomach. What did they do? "They filed an ex parte motion for emergency conservatorship over Raphael." Nolan explained. "And they filed a petition for a temporary guardianship over the estate. But that is not the worst part." "Tell me," I demanded. "The petition claims that Raphael is mentally incompetent," which we knew, "but it also claims that the previous power of attorney is invalid because you are unstable." I gripped the phone so hard the plastic creaked. "Unstable?" "They submitted a sworn affidavit claiming you have a history of substance abuse and have been estranging Raphael from his family to manipulate his finances. They are projecting their own crimes onto you. Charlie, they are trying to get a judge to strip you of your authority before you can use it." I looked around the wrecked living room, the shattered vase, the papers on the floor, the rain soaking the carpet. "They tried to frame me," I said, my voice trembling with rage. "They knew I would find out, so they tried to discredit me preemptively." "It is a standard predator tactic," Nolan said. "Darvo, deny, attack, and reverse victim and offender. They want to make this a muddy legal battle so the bank releases the funds to them just to settle the dispute. We are not just fighting a theft anymore. Charlie, we are fighting a character assassination." I hung up the phone. I stood alone in the house that had been my sanctuary, listening to the storm batter the walls. My parents hadn't just stolen money, they had stolen my reputation. They had put into public record lies that could destroy my career and my life, all to cover a $990,000 debt. I looked at the spot where the front door used to be. The wind was still blowing in, but I didn't feel the cold anymore. I felt the heat of a battle that had just turned nuclear. They wanted a legal war? They were going to get one, and unlike them, I had the truth, and I had the receipts. The call came at 4 in the morning. I was sitting in my car in the hospital parking garage, staring at the concrete wall, too wired to sleep and too terrified to go home to an empty house that had just been a crime scene. When my phone buzzed, I flinched, expecting it to be Nolan with more bad legal news or my parents with another threat. It was Dr. Evans. "Charlie," his voice was crisp, cutting through the fog in my brain. "You need to come up. The sedation is wearing off faster than we anticipated. He is tracking movement with his eyes." I didn't even lock the car. I sprinted to the elevator, my boots slamming against the pavement. The exhaustion that had been dragging at my bones for 3 days evaporated, replaced by a surge of pure, desperate hope. When I reached the ICU, the atmosphere had shifted. The hushed, church-like silence was replaced by the low hum of activity. Nurses were moving in and out of room 312. I stopped in the doorway, my breath catching in my throat. The ventilator was gone. In its place was a simple oxygen mask, and lying there, pale as the sheets but undeniably present, was Rafael Mendoza. His eyes were open. They were glassy and tired, but they were his eyes. Not the vacant stare of a coma patient, but the searching, intelligent gaze of the man who had taught me how to read a balance sheet and how to skip stones on the sound. I walked to the bedside, my legs feeling like jelly. "Papa?" His head turned. A micro-movement. Barely an inch. But it was enough. His eyes found mine. A flicker of recognition lit them up. Faint but unmistakable. I took his hand. It wasn't the limp, heavy weight it had been yesterday. As my fingers wrapped around his, I felt a squeeze. It was weak, a ghost of a grip, but it was the loudest thing I had ever heard. "I am here," I choked out, tears finally spilling over. "I am right here." Behind me, the door whooshed open. Aunt Marisol rushed in, trailing a rolling suitcase and smelling of rain and airport coffee. She took one look at the bed and dropped her bag. Rushing to the other side, she didn't say a word. She just buried her face in his shoulder, sobbing with the kind of relief that shakes your whole body. "He is back," I whispered to her. "He is really back." For an hour, we just sat there. We let the monitors beep their steady rhythm, rewriting the narrative from a tragedy to a miracle. But as the morning light began to filter through the blinds, turning the gray rain outside into a soft silver, the reality of the last 3 days began to bleed into the room. Papa started trying to speak. His voice was a rasp, a sound like dry leaves scraping together. The nurse adjusted his oxygen mask, telling him to take it easy. But he was persistent. He kept looking at me, then at Marisol, then at the empty space where Victor and Elena should have been. "Where?" he croaked. Marisol looked at me, her eyes wide with panic. She didn't want to tell him. She wanted to protect him. But I knew Rafael. He valued truth over comfort. Always. "They are not here, Papa," I said softly, leaning close to his ear. He closed his eyes for a moment, and a pained expression crossed his face. Not physical pain, but a deep, soulful wince. He took a ragged breath and looked at me again. "The account," he whispered. My heart stopped. I thought he was asking about his medical bills. "Don't worry about that," I said. "We have it covered." He shook his head. A tiny, frustrated motion. "No, the trust. The bait." I froze. "The bait?" He swallowed hard, fighting for enough moisture to speak. "I moved the real money 6 months ago." Marisol and I exchanged a stunned look. "What do you mean, Papa?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "The clock," he rasped. "The painting. I knew they were taking things. I knew—" A cold shiver went down my spine. The missing antiques, the ones he had laughed off as his own forgetfulness. He hadn't forgotten. He had been testing them. He had left small valuables out to see if his own son and daughter-in-law would steal from him, and they had. "I created a mirror account," he said, each word a struggle. "Liquid assets, easy to access, to see if they would touch it, I didn't think they would take it all. The revelation hit me with the force of a physical blow. The $990,000 wasn't his entire fortune. It was a test. It was a honeypot. He had suspected Victor and Elena were circling like vultures, so he had left a carcass out to see if they would bite. He had baited the trap with nearly $1 million, gambling that they might take a few thousand, maybe 10,000, and he could catch them and correct them. He never imagined they would drain the whole thing in 3 days while he was on his deathbed. "Oh, Papa," Marisol wept, stroking his hair. "Why didn't you tell us?" "I wanted to be wrong," he whispered, a tear leaking from the corner of his eye and tracking into his silver hairline. "I didn't want to believe my son was a thief." That sentence broke me. It wasn't the anger of a victim. It was the heartbreak of a father. He had set the trap hoping it would stay empty. He had prayed that his suspicion was just the paranoia of old age, but by draining that account, Victor and Elena hadn't just stolen money, they had confirmed his worst nightmare. They had proven that his love meant less to them than his liquidity. "They took almost $1 million. Papa," I said, my voice trembling. "They sent it to shell companies, to pay off gambling debts, to Julian." At the mention of Julian, Papa's eyes hardened, the sadness evaporated, replaced by the steel that had built his business empire. "Julian," he hissed. "I told Victor never to trust him. We stopped it," I assured him quickly. "I found the documents in the desk, the ones in the secret compartment. I sent everything to Nolan. The bank froze the accounts. We are getting it back." He squeezed my hand again, harder this time. "You found the papers?" "Yes," I said. "The new power of attorney, the will, I have them safe." He nodded, closing his eyes as if a great weight had been lifted from his chest. "Good. You are in charge now. Charlie, not them. You." "I know," I said. "I won't let you down." He opened his eyes and looked at me with a clarity that was terrifying. "It is not about the money. It is the betrayal. A family is like a glass. Once it cracks, you can glue it, but it is never the same." He was right. We could recover the funds. We could maybe even keep Victor and Elena out of prison if we played the cards right. But we could never sit at a dinner table again. We could never trust a hug or a birthday card. The fiction of the happy Mendoza family was dead, killed by a wire transfer. "What do you want me to do?" I asked him. He looked at the ceiling, then back at me. "Make sure they don't hurt anyone else. And Charlie?" "Yes." "Papa?" "Use this," he said, gesturing vaguely with his free hand. "Your work, Northline, don't let this happen to other old men who love their children too much." It was a mandate. He was giving me a mission. He didn't just want me to be his executor. He wanted me to be a warrior. He had been a victim of his own blood, and he wanted to make sure that his experience served a purpose. "I promise," I said, leaning my forehead against his hand. "I will make it a program. I will teach people how to spot the signs. I will tell them about the bait accounts. I will tell them everything." "Good," he whispered, his energy finally fading. "Now, let me sleep. No more hospitals." He drifted back into a doze. But this time it was a natural sleep, not a coma. Marisol and I sat in the silence, the weight of his words hanging in the air. We had won the battle for his life. We had won the battle for the money. But looking at his sleeping face, etched with the pain of knowing his son was a predator, I realized the war was far from over. I had the evidence, I had the legal authority, and now I had the moral imperative. Victor and Elena thought they were fighting a daughter. They were about to find out they were fighting a legacy. The legal machinery moved faster than I expected. Within 48 hours of my email to Nolan Pierce, the forensic accountants had peeled back the layers of the Clementine Heritage Foundation. It was not just a shell company, it was a clumsy money laundering operation. Julian Castillo had made a critical error. He hadn't just demanded the money. He had emailed my father detailed instructions on how to structure the wire transfers to bypass the bank's automated fraud detection systems. That email chain was not just advice. It was conspiracy to commit federal wire fraud. The final twist came on a Friday afternoon. Julian, confident that his hands were clean because he bad not physically touch the keyboard, was detained by federal agents at the departure gate of SeaTac International Airport. He was boarding a first-class flight to Cabo San Lucas. He claimed he was just a consultant. The logs of the $200,000 transfer into his personal checking account said otherwise. The man who thought he was the puppet master ended up in handcuffs before the plane even left the tarmac. For my parents, the reality was stark and humiliating. Victor and Elena were offered a choice that was not really a choice. The district attorney, armed with the police report of the break-in and the bank logs, charged them with elder financial exploitation and second-degree burglary. They could roll the dice at a jury trial and risk 20 years. Or they could accept a plea deal. The terms were brutal but fair. Full restitution of every cent, 5 years of strict probation, and a permanent restraining order preventing them from ever contacting Rafael Mendoza or managing any estate again. They signed the papers in a windowless conference room, refusing to make eye contact with me. They did not apologize. They just looked tired, defeated by the weight of their own incompetence. They had gambled their family for a payout, and they had lost both. We managed to recover about $650,000 immediately from the frozen accounts. The rest, which had been scattered into crypto exchanges and gambling debts, would take years of civil litigation to claw back, but the bleeding had stopped. The house was safe. 2 weeks later, Papa came home. He was thinner, and he needed a walker to get up the steps. But he was alive. The front door had been replaced. The new one was solid oak with a steel core and a smart lock that logged every entry. We stood in the foyer, the smell of fresh paint lingering in the air. Papa reached out and touched the new frame, running his hand over the wood where the old hinges had been torn away. "That door," he said, his voice raspy but clear. "It didn't blow open because of the wind. Charlie, the wind was just the messenger. It blew open because this house was too full of lies. It simply couldn't hold them anymore. It spit them out." He was right. The storm had just done what we were too afraid to do. It forced the truth into the open. I did not quit my job at Northline Community Initiatives. Instead, I expanded it. I launched a new program called the Silver Shield Project, dedicated to educating families about the warning signs of financial abuse. I used my own story as the case study. I stood on stages and told strangers about the bait accounts, the missing antiques, and the silence that enables theft. I turned my family's shame into a shield for others. I taught them that sometimes the predator is not a stranger on the phone. Sometimes. The predator is sitting at your Thanksgiving table. Tonight, dinner was quiet. It was just me, Aunt Marisol, and Papa eating arroz con pollo at the kitchen table. There were empty chairs where my parents used to sit. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was peaceful. We were not the perfect family on the Christmas card anymore. We were broken, glued back together, and missing a few pieces. But we were safe. As I watched my grandfather laugh at one of Marisol's jokes, the lines around his eyes crinkling, I realized that the inheritance was never about the money and the trust. The real inheritance was the autonomy to live a life that nobody could steal from you. I had played a game I was never supposed to win, and I walked away with the only prize that mattered: my integrity and the safety of the man who taught me what that word meant. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I want to ask you, have you ever been exploited by a family member for money, or have you seen it happen? Please comment below where you are listening from and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the Lily Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and hit that notification bell so this story can reach more people and help protect them from similar situations.